The morning Maude Shelton decided to leave Dusty Creek for good was the same morning the sun rose the color of a fresh wound, bleeding red and orange across the flat Wyoming sky, as if the land itself knew something irreplaceable was about to slip away. She had been awake since before dawn, long before the roosters belonging to old Henry Pratt got their bearings and started their racket, sitting on the edge of the iron-framed bed she had shared with no one for the past 14 months. The mattress was thin, filled with corn husks that crinkled every time she shifted her weight, and the wool blanket was scratchy against her bare arms. She had stopped noticing those discomforts sometime in early autumn. Now, in the spring of 1882, she noticed everything again, because she was cataloging it all with the deliberate attention of a woman saying goodbye. The trunk at the foot of the bed was already packed. She had done it the night before, folding each dress with careful, almost ceremonial precision, tucking her mother's cameo brooch into the toe of her good boots so it would not get jostled. Her teaching materials were wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. 2 novels she had read 3 times each, a small daguerreotype of her family back in Philadelphia, a tin of lavender sachets. Everything that constituted the sum of Maude Shelton's life in the Wyoming territory fit into one trunk and one carpet bag, and that fact alone was enough to hollow out a place behind her sternum that no amount of practical thinking could fill. She was 26 years old, and she had come to Dusty Creek with fire in her chest and chalk dust on her skirts, believing she could build something meaningful in a place that needed what she had to give. She had come to teach. She had stayed because the children needed her, because the little schoolhouse on the edge of town was the only one within 40 miles, and because for a time she had believed that staying was its own kind of courage. But the school board had voted 3 weeks ago. Voted, deliberated, and ultimately decided that the town could not afford to keep paying a schoolteacher's salary through another dry summer. They had been very polite about it. Elmer Griggs, who served as both the chairman of the school board and the man who ran the general store, had taken his hat off when he told her, which she supposed was meant to convey respect. She had thanked him with her chin level and her voice steady, and then walked back to her rented room at the Callaway boarding house and sat very still for approximately 4 minutes before she pressed her face into her pillow and wept with the quiet, controlled fury of a woman who had learned early in life that the world rarely offered apologies alongside its disappointments. 3 weeks had passed since then. She had spent them writing letters east. Her cousin Alina lived in Philadelphia, in a proper brick row house on a tree-lined street, and Alina had written back within 10 days saying there was a position at the girls' academy where she knew the head mistress, and that Maude was more than welcome to come home, that she had been wondering when Maude would come to her senses about all that frontier business anyway. Maude had read that letter twice, and then folded it very small and tucked it into her carpet bag. She was not coming home because she had come to her senses. She was coming home because Dusty Creek had made its decision, and Maude Shelton had always known when she was not wanted, or she thought she had always known. She rose from the bed and crossed to the washstand, poured cold water from the pitcher into the basin, and pressed a damp cloth to her face. The water was bracingly cold, which helped. She looked at herself in the small clouded mirror above the washstand. Brown hair pinned back, a few strands loose at her temples, gray eyes that her mother had called serious. A face that had been described by various people over the years as handsome, sensible, determined, and once by a man in Cheyenne as the kind of face a person trusted without meaning to. She did not know what to make of that one. She put on her traveling dress, the dark navy wool one that was practical and not too heavy for the season. She pinned her hair properly. She put on her boots. She looked at the trunk. The stagecoach to Cheyenne left at 9:30, and from Cheyenne she could take the Union Pacific East. She had already purchased her ticket. She had already informed Mrs. Calloway, who had looked genuinely sorry and pressed a paper-wrapped parcel of biscuits and dried apricots into Maude's hands the evening before, and told her She was the finest tenant the boarding house had ever had, which Maude suspected was the truest and kindest thing anyone in Dusty Creek had said to her in months. She carried her carpet bag to the door of her room and then stopped. Through the narrow window beside the door, she could see the main street of Dusty Creek coming slowly to life in the early morning light. The blacksmith's fire was already going. A dog of indeterminate breed was crossing the street with great purpose. Two men she did not know well were standing outside the saloon even at this early hour, not drinking but talking, their hats pulled low. The sky beyond the flat rooftops was that extraordinary bleeding color, the kind of sky she had painted in watercolors in her first year here and sent back east to her mother, who had written back saying it seemed very dramatic. It was dramatic. Everything about this country was dramatic. The scale of it, the silence of it when the wind died down, the way the mountains sat on the western horizon like a wall of something ancient and indifferent. She had hated it at first. She had come to love it so slowly and so thoroughly that she had not noticed it happening, the way you do not notice a plant growing until one day you look at the pot on the windowsill and realize the thing is taller than you expected. She picked up her carpet bag. She did not look at the window again. She went downstairs. Mrs. Calloway was in the kitchen and called out that there was hot coffee if she wanted it, and Maude went in and sat at the kitchen table and drank a cup of coffee while Mrs. Calloway pretended not to notice that Maude's hands were not entirely steady. Mrs. Calloway was a large woman with a great silver braid pinned up at the back of her head, and she had been a widow for 9 years, and there was something in the way she moved around her own kitchen, purposeful and unhurried, that Maude had always found quietly comforting. "I left a key on the hall table," Maude said. "I saw it," Mrs. Calloway said. "She was stirring something on the stove. You sure you want to go, honey?" "I am sure," Maude said, which was not entirely true, but was the only answer available to her. "The O'Brien boys will carry your trunk to the stage office when they come around at 7, Mrs. Calloway said. "I already asked them." "Thank you, Margaret." Mrs. Calloway turned from the stove and looked at her with the direct, uncomplicated affection of a woman who did not believe in drawn-out sentimentality but felt things deeply all the same. "You were good for those children, Maude. Better than they deserved, maybe, considering what this town gave you back." Maude set her coffee cup down carefully. "The children were wonderful," she said, and meant it completely. She finished her coffee. She went back upstairs and looked at her room one more time. The indentation her body had made in the mattress over 14 months, the hook on the back of the door where her school coat had hung, the window, the ordinary, inadequate, somehow beloved room. She picked up her carpet bag and went back downstairs. She went out the front door into the morning. The air was cool and smelled of sage and wood smoke and the turned-earth smell of spring, and the sky had shifted from red to gold to the clear, impossible blue that Maude had never found a word for. She stood on the front step of the Calloway boarding house with her carpet bag in her hand and her trunk waiting to be collected, and she looked up and down the main street of Dusty Creek, Wyoming, and she let herself feel it properly for exactly 1 minute. The loss of it. The specific grief of a place you have grown to love deciding it does not need you. Then she squared her shoulders, the way her mother had taught her, the way all the Shelton women squared their shoulders, and she stepped off the front step and began walking toward the stage office. She had gotten perhaps 20 yards when she heard boots on the boardwalk behind her. She did not turn around because people were allowed to walk on boardwalks in the morning without it having anything to do with her. "Miss Shelton." She turned around. Seth Ralston was standing 12 feet away, and he was holding a wildflower. She knew who he was, of course. Everyone in Dusty Creek knew Seth Ralston. He ran the Ralston Ranch about 6 miles east of town, a good-sized spread with cattle, and a reputation for honest dealing that was, in the Wyoming Territory in 1882, worth rather more than people gave it credit for. He was 31 years old, which she knew because she had heard it mentioned, not because she had been paying particular attention. He was tall in the manner of men who have spent their lives working land, not tall as a fact of birth alone, but tall in the way they occupy space, as though they have earned the right to take up that much room in the world. He had dark hair that was somewhat longer than fashionable dark eyes, a jaw that looked like it had opinions about things. He wore the clothes of a working rancher, not a dressed-up version of one, and his hat was a battered brown thing that had clearly been through weather. Maude had exchanged perhaps 24 words with Seth Ralston across 14 months. He had come to the school twice with the Henderson children, who worked summers on his ranch, and whose education he had apparently taken an interest in, which she had found surprising and then quietly admirable. He had attended the harvest social in October where she had played the piano for 2 hours while people danced, and he had stood near the wall for most of it with a cup of something she suspected was not lemonade, and their eyes had met across the room once, and she had looked away first, which was unlike her. She had thought about him sometimes. She was not going to pretend otherwise, at least not to herself in the privacy of her own thoughts. And now he was standing on the boardwalk in the early morning with a wildflower and an expression on his face that was doing something complicated. The wildflower was a blue columbine, she noticed, wild and slightly crook-stemmed, the kind that grew in the rocky ground near the creek. "Mr. Ralston," she said, because a response was clearly required. He took a few steps toward her. He was looking at her with an intensity that was not rude but was very direct, the way this man seemed to do most things, she had noticed. He looked at the carpet bag in her hand. He looked at her face. He held out the columbine. "I heard you're leaving," he said. She took the flower because it seemed wrong to leave it extended in his hand. It was slightly damp at the stem, freshly picked. "News travels in a small town," she said. "It does," he agreed. He took his hat off, which she had come to understand was a gesture men in this part of the world used to signal that they were being serious. His dark hair was pushed back from his face. "I have a question I'd like to ask you, Miss Shelton." She waited. The morning was very quiet around them. A hawk was moving in wide, lazy circles above the edge of town. "Have you ever been to the eastern edge of my property?" he said, and it came out as a question even though its shape was strange. "Where the land rises up toward the foothills. There's a meadow there, about 2 miles in. It gets the light in the late afternoon in a way that I have never been able to adequately describe to another person." She blinked. That was not the question she had been expecting, though she could not have said what question she had been expecting. "I haven't," she said carefully. "I know," he said. "My question is whether you would consider staying long enough to see it." The morning held its breath. Maude looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the wildflower in her hand. She looked back at him. There was a great deal happening in the 17 inches of Wyoming air between them, and she was a woman who paid attention to things. "The stagecoach leaves at 9:30, she said. "I know," he said again. He did not move. He was watching her with those dark eyes that had, she now realized, been watching her longer and more carefully than she had understood. "That gives us a few hours." She should have said no. She had a trunk packed and a ticket purchased, and a cousin waiting in Philadelphia with a job arranged, and a proper life laid out like a clean tablecloth on a proper table. She had made her decision with all the logic and practicality at her disposal. She was Maude Shelton, and Maude Shelton did not do impulsive things. "My trunk needs to be at the stage office by 9, she said. "I'll make sure of it," he said. She looked at him for another moment. The columbine was slightly wilted at the edge of one petal but still very blue and very alive. "I'll need to be back by 8:30 at the latest," she said. Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile. Something quieter and more permanent than a smile. "Yes, ma'am," he said. They walked together out of town. This was not, she told herself, changing her plans. This was a detour. A courtesy extended to a man she had always found interesting. She would see the meadow he was apparently so determined she should see, and then she would get on the stagecoach, and that would be that. His horse was tied at the post outside the stage office, a big chestnut gelding with an even disposition. He also had a smaller roan mare tied beside it, saddled, which she found remarkable. "You brought a horse for me," she said. "I was hoping," he said simply. She looked at the mare. She had learned to ride in her first spring in Dusty Creek, because out here it was either learn or be perpetually dependent on other people, and she was not built for perpetual dependence. She was not expert at it, but she was competent. "You were very confident," she said. "No," he said, and something in his voice told her this was true. "Not confident, just hoping." She let him give her a leg up onto the mare. His hands were large and calloused and completely steady, and he did not hold on longer than necessary, which she noticed, and stepped back immediately to mount his own horse. They rode east out of Dusty Creek in the clear morning light, and she noticed the way the land opened up around them as soon as the buildings of town fell behind, the way the sky became fully itself again, immense and blue, and full of a silence that was not empty but occupied by something she had never managed to name. Meadowlarks were calling. The sage was silver-green in the slanted morning light. A jackrabbit launched itself from the grass ahead of them and disappeared. She had her carpet bag over her shoulder, which was not the most graceful way to ride but was non-negotiable. They rode without talking for the first 10 minutes, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. She had always found silence with most people slightly stressful, the gap that needed filling. With Seth Ralston, she noticed, the silence felt inhabited, as though both of them were simply present in it without needing to cover it over. "Why today?" she said when she felt ready to ask. He glanced at her. They were riding side by side on a track that was wide enough for it, heading toward a line of cottonwood trees that marked what she thought might be a creek. "I should have asked sooner," he said. "That's the honest answer. I've been trying to work out the right way to say certain things for about 10 months. 10 months, she repeated. "Since last summer," he said. "You came out to the Henderson place to check on the kids' lessons. I was there patching fence in the lower field. You didn't notice me. You were talking to Mrs. Henderson about how Robert was ready to move to long division, and I remember thinking." He stopped. "What?" she said, because she needed to know what he had thought. He looked at her directly. "That you were the most interesting person I'd come across in a very long time," he said. "And that I had probably let too much time pass without doing anything about it." Maude was quiet for a moment. The columbine was tucked through the buttonhole of her jacket, which she had done without entirely thinking about it. "You could have introduced yourself properly at the harvest social." "I know," he said, and a slight rueful quality entered his voice. "I started across the room 3 times. What stopped you?" He considered this honestly. "I was afraid," he said, "which is not a comfortable thing to admit, but it's the truth. You were very," he searched for the word, "self-contained, like a person who has everything they need and is deciding what additional things are worth the bother." She almost laughed. She pressed her lips together to manage it. "That is perhaps the most accurate description of me that anyone has ever given me. My mother would agree with you." "Is that why you're going back east?" he asked. "Because you have everything you need there." The question was direct and not unkind, and she respected him for asking it plainly rather than dancing around it. "No," she said after a moment. "I'm going back east because the school board voted to cut my salary and there is nothing left here for me to do." She paused. "Or so I had concluded." They rode through the cottonwood trees, which were lacy with new leaves, the pale green of early spring, and crossed a shallow creek that the horses waded through easily, the water cold and clear over a bed of flat stones. On the other side, the land began a gentle rise toward the foothills, and the grass was longer here, moving in slow waves in a light breeze she could feel against her face. "What is it you do out here?" she asked. "I mean beyond the cattle. The way you've been interested in the Henderson children's schooling suggests you think education matters." He was quiet for a moment in that way she was coming to recognize, the way he actually considered things before answering. "My mother taught school," he said. "In Missouri, before we came west. She believed it was the most important work a person could do. She said everything else, all the ranching and building and making of things, amounted to nothing if the next generation came up without the ability to think clearly." "Your mother sounds exceptional," Maude said. "She was," he said quietly, and she heard the past tense and did not press further. The land was rising more noticeably now, and the horses were picking their way through taller grass dotted with early wildflowers, the same blue columbines he had brought her along with white yarrow, and the small yellow faces of something she did not know the name of. The foothills were ahead of them, brown and green and patched with the dark shapes of pine trees on the higher slopes, and the sky above was that impossible Wyoming blue that she was going to miss for the rest of her life. She was going to miss it for the rest of her life. She recognized that with a clarity that was slightly alarming. They crested a low ridge, and Seth Ralston stopped his horse, and Maude stopped the mare beside him. Below them, cupped between two rises of the land like something held in a pair of careful hands, was the meadow. It was perhaps half a mile across, long and broad and alive with spring grass and wildflowers, and a creek ran through the middle of it catching the morning light. On the far side, the foothills rose up dark with pine, and a pair of hawks were circling above the tree line. There was a stand of aspens on the near bank of the creek, their leaves trembling silver and gold in the light. Mule deer were grazing at the far edge, 5 of them, heads down, moving with the unhurried grace of animals who knew themselves to be safe. She did not say anything for a long time. "I told you I couldn't describe it adequately," Seth said beside her. "You were right," she said. Her voice was slightly different than usual. She was aware of this. "How long have you known about this place?" "Since I was about 17, he said. "My father bought this land when I was 12 and we came west from Missouri. I spent my first years here riding every acre of it, found this place in my first autumn. I've brought exactly 3 other people to see it." She looked at him. "Who were they?" "My father," he said. "My mother before she passed. And my ranch hand Billy, who looked at it for about 30 seconds and said it was fine and wanted to go back and check on the cattle." She laughed then properly, and it surprised her, the ease of it, the way it came out fully formed and unguarded. Seth Ralston smiled at the sound of it, and it was the first time she had seen him properly smile, and it rearranged his face in a way that made something in her chest do an ungainly thing she was not prepared for. "Why did you want me to see it?" she asked, and her voice was quieter now. He looked at the meadow for a moment, and then he looked at her. "Because I have been trying to think of the right words to explain why you shouldn't leave," he said slowly. "And I don't have them. I'm not good with the kind of words that say important things. So I thought I would show you instead." She was looking at him. The morning was warm on her shoulders, and the meadow was below them full of light and life and the sound of water, and she had a stagecoach to catch in less than 3 hours. "Seth," she said, and used his given name without thinking about it, and neither of them acknowledged it, which felt like a choice. "I know this is very late," he said, and his voice was measured but not controlled. There was something working underneath the surface of it that she could hear clearly. "I know I should have found a way to say this months ago. I know you have a ticket and a cousin and a sensible plan." He looked at his hands on the reins for a moment and then back at her. "But I am asking you to stay, and I'm asking you to give me the chance to show you that I mean something by it." She looked at him for a long time. She had learned to read people well, in the way teachers learn, paying attention to what lay beneath what was said. What she was reading in Seth Ralston was not the performance of feeling but the real and slightly uncomfortable thing itself. He was a man who did not say things he did not mean. She was entirely confident of that. "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Ralston?" she asked, and her voice was steady but her heart was not. "Courtship," he said simply. "A proper one. Give me 2 weeks before you go. If at the end of 2 weeks you still want to take that train east, I will personally carry your trunk to the station and see you off, but I want the chance to make my case." 2 weeks, she repeated. 2 weeks, he said. She looked at the meadow again. She looked at the mule deer at the far edge. She looked at the aspens catching the light. She looked at the columbine in her jacket buttonhole. "I'll need to send a letter to my cousin Alina," she said, explaining the delay. Something happened in his eyes. "I can take you to the post office before the stage leaves," he said. "You can tell them not to hold the seat for you." She took a breath of Wyoming spring air. It smelled of sage and the creek and something green and alive that she did not have a word for. 2 weeks, she said, and it was an agreement. He let out a breath that told her he had been holding it. Thank you, Miss Shelton. Maude, she said, because she had already used his name and it seemed correct. Maude, he said, and something in the way he said it, quiet and careful, as if he were placing something valuable down on a surface, made her understand that this man had been thinking her name for a very long time. They sat in that meadow for the better part of an hour, the horses grazing, the morning warming around them, and they talked. She had not expected how easy it would be to talk to him. She had imagined, in the vague way she had occasionally allowed herself to imagine him, that he might be a man of few words to an uncomfortable degree, closed off in the way some ranch men were, where conversation felt like pulling nails. But he was not that. He was careful with his words, yes, measured in a way she found extraordinarily restful, but he was not withholding. He had thoughts about things, real thoughts, and he expressed them in the plain, direct way of a man who had spent a great deal of time alone with his own thinking. He told her about his mother, who had died 4 years ago from a fever that had swept through the valley in the terrible summer of 1878. He told her about his father, who was still alive but had sold his portion of the land to Seth and gone to live with Seth's sister in Colorado. He told her about the ranch, not boasting about it, just explaining it as a thing he had built and continued to build, the cattle, the land, the 2 hands who worked for him. A man named Billy who was 35 and had been on the ranch for 6 years, and a younger man named Clem who had arrived the previous autumn and was learning. She told him about Philadelphia, about the small house she had grown up in, her father who had been a printer and her mother who had been a teacher, and who had died 2 years ago, leaving Maude as the last Shelton in a direct line. She told him about the decision to come west, how it had been less heroic than people imagined and more desperate, in the quiet way that desperation sometimes visits itself upon a person who needs a sense of purpose and cannot find it in the life arranged for them. She told him about her first weeks in Dusty Creek, the strangeness of everything, the scale of the landscape and the smallness of the social world, the way the 2 things should have balanced each other but somehow only amplified each other. He listened to all of it with the complete attention that she had noticed about him and found unusual in a world where most people listened mainly to find their next opening to speak. When they rode back into Dusty Creek, it was nearly 8:30 and the town was properly awake. She went to the stage office and told the clerk she would not be taking that day's departure. She wrote a quick letter to Alina that said she was fine, that she had some things to attend to, that she would write more fully in a few days. She posted it at the small post office beside the general store while Seth tied the horses outside. Mrs. Calloway, when Maude came back to the boarding house to explain that she would need her room for at least another 2 weeks, simply looked at her steadily for a moment and then said, "The trunk is still in your room. I told those O'Brien boys to leave it when I saw you ride out with Seth Ralston this morning." Maude stared at her. "You saw us ride out. I watch out the kitchen window every morning, Mrs. Calloway said completely unapologetically. "It's the best part of my day." She turned back to the stove. "I'll add the 2 weeks to your account." "You are a very perceptive woman, Margaret," Maude said. "I know," Mrs. Calloway agreed. The 2 weeks that followed were unlike anything Maude had experienced before, and she had experienced enough to have some standard for comparison. Seth Ralston courted her with the same quality he brought to everything else: deliberateness, honesty, and a complete absence of performance. He did not try to impress her with grand gestures, or not only that. He came every day, usually in the late afternoon when his work was done, and sometimes he brought things: a book he thought she might like, a jar of wild honey from some hives he had found near the creek, once a small piece of quartz he had found that was threaded through with a vein of something that caught the light in an extraordinary way. But mostly he brought himself, and he gave her his full attention, and he asked her things and listened to the answers. On the 3rd day, he took her to see the herd. riding out with her in the early morning while the cattle were moving to their grazing ground, and he showed her the working of the ranch without any self-consciousness, the ordinary mechanics of the place he had built. She watched him with his men, the way he spoke to Billy and Clem, direct and respectful, and not the kind of man who needed to establish himself through severity. Billy was a compact, weathered, cheerful man who tipped his hat to Maude and said she was the best news the Ralston ranch had ever had, which made Seth say his name in a warning tone and made Maude laugh. She began to understand, riding across his land with him in those bright spring days, that Seth Ralston had made something real here. He had taken a piece of this vast, difficult, beautiful country and shaped it into a life that had coherence and meaning. The land was not just his property, it was the expression of something in him, the same serious and purposeful quality that was in all the rest of him. On the 5th day it rained, a proper spring rain that came in the afternoon and made it impossible to ride anywhere. He came to the boarding house and Mrs. Calloway, showing no surprise whatsoever, showed them to the small parlor and brought them coffee and a plate of things, and left them alone with the door open in the interest of propriety, which Maude appreciated even if it was slightly unnecessary given that she was 26 years old and not in the habit of requiring chaperones. They sat across from each other in the parlor with the rain coming down the windows and they talked for 3 hours. This was, she decided later, the day that undid her completely. Not the meadow, not the rides across the open country, not the Wildflower. The rainy afternoon in Mrs. Calloway's parlor talking. He told her about loneliness. He did it simply and without any attempt to make it pathetic or to use it to press for sympathy. He had been alone out on that ranch for 4 years since his mother died, not lonely in the destructive sense, not pining, but alone in the way a person is when they have built a life and find it containing all the practical things and missing the one essential. He said this quietly, looking at his coffee cup, and then looked up at her. She told him she understood that. She told him about the particular loneliness of being a schoolteacher in a small town, the way you occupied a very specific and slightly elevated social position that meant people were always slightly formal with you, always a little bit treating you as the teacher rather than as a person. She told him about the evening she had walked back from the schoolhouse alone in the first frost of her first winter and looked up at the sky full of stars and felt, just for a moment, completely transparent, as though she might simply dissolve into the cold air and no one would particularly notice. He was looking at her very directly. "I would have noticed," he said. "It was the right thing to say." It was the perfectly right thing to say, and she knew with some certainty that he had not calculated it, that it was simply true. After the rain stopped they walked to the edge of town where the road went out east, and stood looking toward the foothills in the clean-washed air that came after rain, when everything smelled new. He stood close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him, and she did not move away. She wrote to Alina again on the 8th day, a longer and more honest letter this time, saying that she had met someone and she needed more time, and she was sorry for the inconvenience. Alina's response, when it came 10 days later and therefore after the 2 weeks had already resolved themselves naturally, said that she had suspected something of the kind and that Maude had always done things in her own ridiculous way, and Alina supposed she was not going to start being sensible now. Maude read this letter sitting on the front step of the boarding house in the warm May sunshine and felt extremely fond of her cousin. On the 10th day, Seth asked her if she would come to supper at the ranch. He was careful about it, careful about her reputation, which she found touching, and he said Billy and Clem would both be there, which made it a supper of 4 and therefore entirely proper, and that he had been cooking it all day. She arrived at the Ralston ranch in the late afternoon in Seth's wagon, having declined the offer of another horse ride on the grounds that she wished to arrive looking presentable. The ranch house was not grand, but it was solid and carefully made, a long low structure of pine logs with a porch along the front and a kitchen garden to one side that was clearly tended but not, she suspected, by Seth, and she asked about it, and he admitted that Mrs. Henderson came twice a week to look after it, in exchange for which he let her family graze a few cattle on his south pasture. She liked the economy of that, the web of small practical generosities that held a community together out here. The inside of the house was clean and spare, with the particular quality of a space that a man has arranged for function rather than decoration. But there were books, a solid number of them on shelves flanking the fireplace, and the fireplace itself was impressive, made of river stone. Billy was already there, looking very scrubbed and wearing what was apparently his best shirt, and Clem, who was young, perhaps 19, with sandy hair and a broad, honest face, stood up when she came in and turned a remarkable color that she found endearing. Seth had cooked an elk stew that was extraordinary, and there was cornbread, and they sat around the rough-hewn table in the kitchen and ate and talked, and she watched Seth in his own space, comfortable and easy and himself, and understood something important about who he was. After supper, Billy and Clem very tactfully found reasons to be elsewhere, and she and Seth sat on the porch as the sun went down behind the foothills and turned the sky those colors she could never describe adequately. It was the first time they had been properly alone, without the open door of Mrs. Calloway's parlor or the broad exposure of open country around them. "I keep thinking about what you said," she said, "about not being good with important words." He looked at her. The last light was on his face, making it all angles and shadow and something warm. "What about it?" "I think you're wrong," she said. "I think you are very good with them." He was quiet for a moment. "Maude," he said, and again she noticed the particular weight he placed on her name. "Are you still planning to leave at the end of the 2 weeks?" "No," she said. She let the word stand there plainly. He let out a slow breath. He looked at the sky. He looked back at her. "What changed?" he asked, because he needed to understand it, not for vanity, but because he was a man who needed to know things were real. "I started to understand what I would be giving up," she said simply. He reached over and took her hand where it rested on the arm of the porch chair, and he held it in both of his, carefully, with the same quality of deliberateness he brought to everything. She felt the warmth and the roughness of his palms, the specific living weight of a hand that had built things and worked things and was now holding hers as if it were the most important thing he had held in some time. "I want you to stay," he said, "permanently. I want to court you properly, and I want—" He stopped, reorganized. "I am going to say this plainly because I don't know another way. I want to marry you, Maude. I'm not proposing right now because it's too soon, and I know that. But I want you to know what my intentions are." She looked at him in the last of the evening light. A nighthawk was calling somewhere, the high, keen sound of it threading through the dusk. "I appreciate the plainness," she said. "Do you appreciate what I said?" "Very much," she said. He held her hand as the sky darkened, and neither of them needed to say anything else. The town's reaction to the developing courtship between Seth Ralston and the schoolteacher was vigorous, as small-town reactions to romantic developments always are. This being Dusty Creek, everyone had known within approximately 2 days of the morning he arrived with the Wildflower, because several people had witnessed it, and the information had spread with the efficiency of things that people genuinely want to discuss. The opinions were almost universally positive, which Maude found both touching and slightly excessive. Elmer Griggs stopped her in the general store to say he was glad she had decided to stay, which she accepted with more graciousness than he perhaps deserved, given that his school board vote was the reason she had packed in the first place. Martha Henderson squeezed her arm and said she had been hoping something would happen, that she had been trying to figure out for months how to arrange for them to be in the same place at the same time. Several people told her independently that Seth Ralston was the finest man in the county, and Maude, who was forming her own very thorough conclusions on this subject, agreed politely each time. There was one difficult conversation, in the 3rd week of her extended stay, with a woman named Clara Prentice, who was the wife of the wealthiest landowner in the area, and who had apparently had her own ideas about Seth Ralston's future. Clara was cool to Maude in the post office one morning, and the specific quality of her coolness made its implications clear. Maude looked at her with the even gray gaze that her mother had called her best feature, said good morning pleasantly, and bought her stamps and left. She told Seth about it that afternoon when he came to find her, and he rubbed the back of his neck in a way that told her this was not news to him. Clara Prentice has been, he started. You don't have to explain, Maude said. There is nothing to explain. I want to explain, he said. Because I don't want there to be any confusion between us about anything. I have never given Clara Prentice any encouragement. Her interest has been entirely her own manufacture. I have been very clear with her about this. I believe you, Maude said, and she did completely. He looked at her with an expression of faint relief mixed with something that was not quite gratitude but adjacent to it, the expression of a man who has been carrying something and has just been told he can put it down. Thank you, he said. She had, in those weeks, been spending her days in a peculiar kind of limbo. She had no school to run. She had no professional purpose. She helped Mrs. Calloway in the mornings, which the older woman accepted without pretending she needed the help, which was its own form of tact. She read. She walked. She made friends more thoroughly with people she had always been slightly too busy with schoolwork to befriend properly. She had long talks with the doctor's wife, a sharp and funny woman named Harriet Bloom who had come west from New Hampshire, and had opinions about everything and the vocabulary to express them. And this friendship, she realized, was something she would have developed much sooner if she had not always been preoccupied with lesson plans and student assessments. She also, in the evenings when Seth came, and they walked or sat on the boarding house porch or rode out in the long spring light, came to understand the architecture of him. His family had come west from Missouri in 1863 when he was 12, which meant they had been coming west as the Civil War raged in the East, and she asked him about that, and he told her his father had refused to let his sons be conscripted, that they had left their farm in the night and headed west with 2 wagons and everything they could carry. He had complicated feelings about that, she understood, the thing that had saved his life and his brother's life at the cost of everything known and settled. His older brother Thomas had gone back east in 1871, married a woman in St. Louis, and Seth had not seen him in 4 years. Letters crossed between them irregularly. She asked him once, on a warm evening when they were sitting on his porch because she had come to ride with him in the late afternoon and stayed for supper as had become habitual, about the injustice of it, the way this country was being settled, the people who had been here before any of them arrived. He was quiet for a moment in the way that told her he had thought about this, and it was not comfortable thinking. I know what this land was before my father bought it, he said. I know who roamed it. I have seen things in my years out here that I carry the weight of. He paused. There are Arapaho people who still move through this region, and I have always tried to treat them with the respect due to people on their own ground, whatever any government paper says. It doesn't undo what's been done, but it's what I can offer. She thought this was an honest answer, more honest than most men would have been. In the 5th week of her extended stay, which she no longer thought of as an extension of anything but simply as her life in its current form, Seth took her to a gathering of families from the surrounding area, a spring roundup celebration at the Henderson Ranch that served also as a social occasion, with food and fiddle music and children running everywhere. She had been to gatherings like this before, as the school teacher, in the slightly formal position that represented. This was different. She arrived with Seth, and the difference in how people responded to her was both gratifying and slightly amusing. She was still Maude Shelton, the same woman she had always been, but arriving at Seth Ralston's side recontextualized her for people in a way that said she belonged here, and the warmth this generated was genuine and overwhelming. An older woman named Agnes Coldwater, who was 73 years old and had come west in a wagon in 1845, and had strong opinions about every living person in the territory, took Maude's hand in both of hers and looked at her with sharp small eyes that missed nothing and said, "He's been alone too long. You'll do." Maude later told Seth about this, and he covered his face with one hand, and she laughed so hard she had to sit down. He asked her properly on the 53rd day. She counted afterward. She had not been counting at the time, or not consciously, but she knew the day well enough to count back. It was a Tuesday afternoon in early June, the air warm and sweet with the smell of the wild roses that grew along the creek on the eastern edge of his property. He had come to get her in the morning, and said he wanted to show her something, which was a sentence she now associated with very good things. He had ridden with her out past the ranch, past the east meadow, along the creek where the wild roses were blooming in great cascading sprays of pale pink, their scent extraordinary in the warm air. They rode until the land curved around a rocky outcropping she had not been to before, and on the other side of it, tucked against the stone with a pine tree growing above it, was a flat-topped boulder with a view across the valley toward the mountains that was, she thought, quite possibly the finest single view she had ever seen. They dismounted and sat on the boulder, their horses grazing below them, and she could see for what felt like 50 miles in 3 directions, the valley and the creeks and the dark shapes of other ranches and the mountains blue and white in the distance, and the sky above all of it enormous and permanent. "You have been collecting views to show me," she said. "I have," he agreed. He was looking at the mountains. "I have been saving this one." "Why this one last?" He looked at her then, and the expression on his face was the one she had come to understand was him being completely unguarded, with all the natural composure set aside, and what was underneath it was something so straightforward and so genuine that it still, after 7 weeks of it, did something decisive to her internal organs. "Because I was going to ask you something here," he said, "and I wanted to be sure when I asked it that you understood what the question included." She understood what he meant. The view was not incidental. The view was the question, or the context of the question, or the place that said, "This is what I am asking you to be part of." He reached into his jacket pocket and brought out a small ring. It was not a fashionable piece, not the elaborate gold settings that were popular in the East. It was a simple band with a small turquoise stone set in silver, worked in the style of the craftspeople of the Southwest, smooth and blue-green and beautiful in its own quiet way. She looked at it. "My mother's," he said. "It was a gift she received from a Navajo woman she helped during our first year in the territory. She wore it on her right hand. She told me once she wanted it to go to someone I believed in." Maude looked at the ring and then at Seth Ralston, at this serious and deliberate and deeply good man sitting beside her on a flat boulder with the mountains behind him and the whole Wyoming valley spread below, holding a ring that had belonged to his mother. "Will you marry me, Maude?" he said, plainly and completely, with no embellishment because he did not do things with embellishment. "Yes," she said, with the same plainness, because it was the truest word she had, and it deserved to be said without decoration. He put the ring on her finger. His hands were not steady, she noticed, which told her things she stored away carefully. She closed her other hand over his when the ring was seated. They sat on that boulder for a long time, with the ring on her finger and his hand under hers and the mountains in front of them, and neither of them felt any need to be anywhere else. The wedding was in August of 1882, on a Saturday, because Saturday was the day the most people could come, and a great many people came. Maude wrote to Eleanor, who wrote back with such a mixture of exasperated affection and genuine happiness that Maude read the letter 3 times. Eleanor could not make the journey west for the wedding, which was expected and understood, but she sent a package that arrived 2 weeks before the date containing a length of cream-colored muslin for a dress and a set of silver hair combs that had belonged to their grandmother, and Maude held the hair combs for a long time before she put them away. Mrs. Calloway, who turned out to have seamstress skills she had never mentioned, spent several evenings helping Maude make the dress. It was a simple thing, the cream muslin cut in the current fashion with a proper bodice and a skirt that moved well, and she wore the hair combs and her mother's cameo brooch, and the turquoise ring that she had not taken off since Seth placed it there. Seth, when he saw her walk into the church, stopped moving entirely for approximately 3 seconds, which was noted and appreciated by everyone present. The ceremony was conducted by the minister who came through Dusty Creek once a month on his circuit, a spare and serious man named Reverend Alcott, who had been conducting weddings and funerals across the Wyoming territory for 20 years, and had the air of a man who understood that both were equally important and should be treated accordingly. He married them in front of approximately 60 people, which was most of Dusty Creek and a number of surrounding ranching families, and it was short and real, and when Seth said the words, his voice was completely steady and his eyes were on her the entire time. She said her own words looking back at him, and meant every syllable with a completeness she had not previously understood was possible. Billy, who had apparently been asked to organize the celebration afterward, had done so with a thoroughness that suggested he had been waiting for an occasion worth this level of effort. There was a table of food that Agnes Coldwater and Martha Henderson and approximately 6 other women had spent 2 days preparing. There was a fiddle player from over near Cheyenne who was extraordinarily good. The afternoon went on for many hours in the warm August air behind the church, with children running and people dancing, and the mountains sitting blue and perfect on the horizon. She danced with Seth in the middle of it all, in the open air, with the fiddle music around them and the August sky above, and he danced with the same quality he did everything else, carefully and with complete attention, and she thought that this was perhaps the best she had ever felt in her life, and then revised that thought because she was fairly sure it would only improve. They went back to the ranch that evening, the 2 of them, and it was home now, her home, and the strangeness and rightness of that occupied her quietly as they came up the road in the wagon, with the last of the evening light gilding everything, and the nighthawks calling in the cooling air. She had moved her things to the ranch 2 days before the wedding, which had required several trips and the cheerful assistance of Billy and Clem, and Mrs. Calloway had hugged her properly when she left the boarding house for the last time, and Maude had felt the loss of that warm kitchen and that large, calm woman, and then set it beside all the other things she was gaining, and found the accounting satisfactory. She had also, in the weeks between the engagement and the wedding, had a long conversation with Elmer Griggs about the school. She was not a woman who let things stand when they ought to be addressed. She went to the general store on a weekday morning when it was quiet, and she told Elmer Griggs that Dusty Creek needed a school, and that the children she had been teaching for 14 months deserved continuity of education, and that the question of salary could perhaps be revisited given that the district had found funds for other things. She said all of this with perfect courtesy, and her chin level and her gray eyes direct. Elmer Griggs scratched the back of his neck and said the situation had changed somewhat, in that several new families had settled in the area over the spring, and the tax base was a little healthier than it had been when the vote was taken, and that he supposed the board should probably meet again. The board met 2 weeks after the wedding, and they voted unanimously to reinstate the position of schoolteacher for Dusty Creek, with a salary that was, while not extravagant, adequate, and with the expectation that the school term would begin in September. Maude read the letter from the school board at the kitchen table of the Ralston ranch with Seth across the table drinking his morning coffee, and she set the letter down and looked at him. "They want me back," she said. "I know," he said, and she narrowed her eyes at him. "Did you speak to Elmer Griggs?" "I mentioned some things to some people," he said with a careful quality that told her everything. "Seth Ralston, you are an exceptional teacher," he said, "and those children deserve you. And Dusty Creek owes you a good deal more than a graceful goodbye." She looked at him for a moment. She was going to address this further. She was going to have a full conversation about the fact that she was perfectly capable of fighting her own battles. "Thank you," she said first, because she was grateful, and because it had been done from love and she was not going to pretend otherwise. "Now tell me you intend to sort Elmer Griggs out completely on your own terms," he said, reading her entirely. "I already did," she said. "I just didn't know you were working on the same problem from another direction." He smiled at her. "We'll be efficient together," he said. She picked the letter back up. "We will," she said. The school reopened in September, and Maude Shelton, who was now Maude Ralston but who continued to be called Miss Shelton by every one of her students because the habits of children are stubborn things, walked into that small whitewashed schoolhouse on the first morning of the term with chalk and lesson books, and the specific feeling of being exactly where she was supposed to be. Seth had driven her to town that first morning in the wagon. He had not made a ceremony of it, but he had driven very slightly out of his way to pass the edge of the meadow on the eastern property, just for a moment, the way a person touches something precious quickly and without explanation. She had looked at the meadow in the early light and felt the thread of it, the first morning, the wildflower, the question, and now this, all of it connected by a line she could feel but not see. "Good day, Miss Shelton," he said when he let her down from the wagon in front of the schoolhouse. "Good day, Mr. Ralston," she said, and their eyes met with all of it in them, the whole absurd and irreplaceable story of how they had arrived at this exact moment. She turned and walked into the school. She heard the wagon move away behind her, heading back to the ranch, and she was not bereft by it because she knew exactly where he was going and exactly where she was going and exactly where they would both be at the end of the day. And this was a kind of anchor she had not known she needed until she had it. The autumn of 1882 passed in a way that she thought later she would always remember as one of the finest periods of her life. The school was going well, the children were hungry for learning, and she had a new student, a girl named Ruby who was 8 years old and had arrived with her family from Kansas, and whose intelligence was of the kind that required careful feeding or it would find destructive outlets. Maude fed it carefully and found the work enormously satisfying. At home, which was the ranch, she was learning the rhythms of a different life, the early mornings, the way the work of a ranch shaped the day, the presence of Billy and Clem who were like two very different spirited brothers that she had acquired without planning to. Billy was dry and funny, and fiercely loyal to Seth in the way of a man who had served alongside someone long enough to know them entirely. Clem was young and enthusiastic, and had taken to calling her Mrs. Ralston with a respect that was touching, and she taught him to read better than he had been managing, at the kitchen table on winter evenings, which he absorbed with a concentrated effort that moved her. She and Seth fell into the particular rhythm of married people who suit each other well, which is both more ordinary and more miraculous than the romantic imagination tends to represent. They disagreed sometimes. She was organized to a degree that occasionally found his lack of system in certain domestic matters frustrating. He found her tendency to take on more than she ought, to say yes to every need the town or the school presented, something he worried about and said so plainly. They worked through these things in the direct way that seemed to be the only mode either of them operated in, and came out the other side more certain of each other rather than less. In November of that year, she missed her monthly cycle for the first time. She waited another 4 weeks to be certain before she told Seth, sitting across from him at the kitchen table after supper with the lamp between them making the room warm and intimate and small. He looked at her when she told him with an expression that went through several evolutions rapidly, surprise and then something so unguarded and large that she felt it across the table like a warmth. He reached across and took her hand. "Are you well?" he asked first, because that was the man he was. "I am very well," she said, "slightly nauseous in the mornings but otherwise entirely well." He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "I am going to need a moment." She waited while he had his moment, watching him with the pleasure of watching someone feel something completely and without any attempt to manage how it looked. "A baby," he said finally, with the simple wonder of the word. "In approximately June," she said. He came around the table and he held her, and she held him back, and it was one of the best moments she had ever been in a year that had been full of them. The pregnancy proceeded through the winter in the normal way, which meant she was tired in ways she had not known tiredness could manifest, and occasionally nauseated at inconvenient moments. And then, somewhere around the 4th month, gloriously, abundantly well, full of energy and appetite and a warmth toward everything in her world that felt physical, as though she were radiating it outward. She continued teaching through the winter and into the spring, because the children needed her and the work sustained her, and also because the idea of sitting at home being careful was not Maude Shelton Ralston's understanding of what she was for in the world. Seth did not argue this. He drove her to school and picked her up. He made sure she ate properly, which she did not always do when absorbed in lesson plans. He worried, which she accepted with gratitude and occasionally found necessary to moderate. Agnes Coldwater, who had delivered approximately 40 babies in the Wyoming territory, and whose knowledge on the subject exceeded that of the town's actual doctor, which she expressed without any false modesty, took Maude thoroughly under her wing beginning around the 5th month. Maude found this arrangement entirely agreeable. Agnes was terrifying and knowledgeable and completely without sentimentality, and Maude trusted her implicitly. "You're healthy as a horse," Agnes told her in April in the brisk clinical manner she applied to everything. "Do not coddle yourself. Move around, eat, sleep." She paused and looked at Maude sharply. "The baby is sitting well. It will be a boy." Maude told Seth this over supper, and he raised an eyebrow and said, "Agnes Coldwater tells you the baby is a boy as if she has information the rest of us lack." "I suspect she might," Maude said. "I have stopped trying to argue with Agnes about things she has decided she knows." In the first week of June, 1883, exactly 1 year after Seth had asked her to marry him on the boulder above the valley, their son was born. He was born at the ranch in the bedroom, with Agnes Coldwater present and Mrs. Calloway, who had come out to be useful and was, and Seth, who had been downstairs for the first part of it, and then, at Maude's insistence, was present for the rest of it, which was not common practice but was Maude's practice and therefore happened. The labor was long and not gentle, but Maude was not a woman who was defeated by difficulty, and Agnes Coldwater's steady and completely unfrightened presence was an anchor throughout. When the baby arrived, red-faced and furious and immediately and loudly opinionated about his new situation, Agnes received him with the efficiency of 40 years' experience and the slightly smug expression of a woman who had been right about the sex. Seth, when Agnes placed the baby in his arms, held him with the careful, overwhelmed attention of a man handling the most important thing he had ever been given. He looked at Maude over the baby's head with an expression she had no words for, and she was a woman who generally had words for things. "Are you all right?" he said, the first words he said, and she wanted to laugh but she was too tired. "I am completely all right," she said. "Is he?" "He is magnificent," Agnes Coldwater said firmly, settling the matter. They named him James after Maude's father, with Thomas as a second name for Seth's brother. James Thomas Ralston was a loud, emphatic, red-haired child who appeared to have arrived in the world with strong views about most things, which both of his parents found extremely appropriate. Billy, when he was allowed in to see the baby, stood holding his hat and looking at James with an expression of completely undefended tenderness that made Maude like him enormously. "He's got your hair, Mrs. Ralston," he said. "He does," she agreed, pleased. Clem, who had been told to stay outside and had done so with the anxious concentration of a young man trying very hard to be good about rules, was brought in afterward and looked at the baby with round eyes and said, "He's real small," which was the most honest observation anyone had made all day. The summer that followed was the softer, fuller kind of difficult, which is the difficulty of learning to be 3 people instead of 2, of learning to sleep when the opportunity arose, of learning the specific daily language of a baby who had definite opinions and the lung capacity to express them. It was exhausting in a way that was also complete, as though she were always entirely occupied, every part of her in use. Seth was, she discovered, wonderful at this, which surprised her not because she thought poorly of him, but because she had not known how a man who had been alone for so long would navigate the chaos of new life. He took to it with the same seriousness he brought to everything. He got up in the nights. He learned James's rhythms faster than she did in some respects, the way he held him, the particular motion that settled him. He was present in the full sense of the word, and watching him with his son made her love him in an additional way, a different register of it, layered over everything that was already there. That autumn, Ruby, the student she had identified as exceptionally gifted, read her way through everything Maude had in the schoolhouse and demanded more, and Maude wrote to Alina in Philadelphia asking her to send whatever she could, educational books, novels, mathematics texts, anything, and Alina sent 2 large parcels that arrived in November and kept Ruby and half the class occupied through the winter. The winter of 1883 and into 1884 was hard in the way Wyoming winters were, cold that was not negotiable and snow that came and stayed and made the ranch a world unto itself for weeks at a time. She did not mind it as she had minded the first winter, when it had felt like confinement. Now it felt like solitude of a chosen kind, the snow making the world small and warm in their own, the ranch house full of firelight and the smell of food, and James, who was learning to pull himself upright on the furniture, and regarded each new achievement as a conquest worthy of a general. She and Seth had the winter evenings. They had always had the evenings, but winter gave them more of them, and they used them well, reading and talking and playing cards badly and talking some more. She had brought his reading further along since their marriage, had introduced him to novels he would not have found on his own, and he had read them with the same serious, engaged quality he brought to everything, and had opinions about them that were always interesting because he came at them from a particular angle, from the perspective of a man who had built his understanding of the world from experience rather than from books. And the friction between those 2 ways of knowing something generated conversations she found endlessly engaging. He told her once, on a winter evening, that she had made him smarter, and she told him that was not true, that she had only given him more material to work with, and that the intelligence had been his all along, and he had looked at her with a quality of feeling that made the lamp between them feel very small against it. James took his first proper steps on a February morning in 1884, walking from the kitchen table to his father's outstretched hands with the tottering determination of a red-haired boy who had decided to do a thing, and was going to do it regardless of physics. Seth caught him and stood up, and they turned to look at Maude, father and son both with the same expression of slightly surprised triumph. She put down her coffee cup and came to them both. In the spring of that year, Billy got married, which nobody on the ranch had seen coming except Maude, who had noticed a certain quality of attention in Billy's manner, whenever he was in the same room as the woman from over near Hargrove who ran the millinery shop, a widow named Susan Petty who was 38 and French-Canadian, and had very direct eyes and a dry wit that matched Billy's own in a way Maude had found quietly inevitable. When Billy told them he was courting Susan, Seth looked genuinely surprised, and Maude did not say a word about the fact that she had been expecting it since January. The spring also brought another decision. Maude had been thinking over the winter about the school, about what it could be and what it currently was, about the children who were outgrowing what she could offer them with the limited materials and the single room and the sessions that ended when farm work called students away. She wrote a proposal, a proper formal document, arguing for an expanded school building and a modest fund for books and materials and the possibility of eventually a second teacher, and she presented it to the school board at a meeting she had requested. Elmer Griggs, she was fairly certain, would have said no immediately if Seth had not been sitting beside her in that meeting, not saying anything, not lobbying, simply present in the way that said this was something he supported, and he was not a man who could be easily dismissed. She would address with Seth later the question of how much she needed him to accompany her to school board meetings. She would have that conversation. But at this particular meeting, the board listened to her proposal properly, asked several good questions, and ultimately agreed to a reduced version of it that was still significantly more than she had begun with. She and Seth had an extremely constructive conversation on the way home about exactly how she felt about the fact that his presence had materially affected the board's response. He listened to the whole thing without defensiveness, nodded at the end, and said she was right and he had not thought about it that way and he would let her handle the next school board meeting entirely on her own. She accepted this. Then he said, "But was the outcome good?" And she said yes. And he said, "Then I'm glad." And she was not entirely sure she was finished being annoyed, but she also was not entirely sure she was annoyed at all. And this was the nature of being married to Seth Ralston in the best possible sense. The new school building broke ground in the autumn of 1884, with Seth among the men who volunteered labor for it, which Maude observed on the first day of construction from the doorway of the existing schoolhouse with the children crowding behind her to see. And one of the students, a boy named Henry whose older brother had once told Maude she was the best teacher he had ever had, said, "Is that your husband, Miss Shelton?" And she said yes, and Henry said, "He's really tall." And this observation traveled around the class and became the principal fact anyone retained about the day. In the winter of 1884, she discovered she was expecting again. This time she told Seth on a Sunday morning early, while it was still dark outside and James was asleep, and the house was quiet, and the fire was just beginning to catch. He had brought her a cup of coffee because she had discovered over 2 years of marriage, the kind of man who brought his wife coffee in the morning as a matter of course and without fanfare. And she had come to regard this as one of the finest qualities a person could possess. She told him sitting up in bed with the coffee, and he sat beside her and held her hand and said, "June again, maybe." And she said she thought more like July, and he said, "James will be very interested to have an opinion about someone smaller than himself." And she laughed, and the quiet of the dark winter morning held them both. Their daughter was born in July of 1885, and Agnes Coldwater, who had been present again with the satisfaction of someone who has found their purpose and occupies it fully, looked at the baby girl and said she would be trouble, which Agnes meant as a compliment. They named her Clara Louise, Clara for no Mrs. Prentice, but for a gray-tan of Seth's who had been, according to his father, the most formidable woman in Missouri, and Louise for her mother Margaret Louise Calloway, who had been the first friend Maude had made in Dusty Creek, and whose kitchen had been one of the kindest places of her life. Margaret Calloway, when told the baby was named partly for her, sat down at her own kitchen table and was quiet for a full minute, which was not her habit, and then pressed her lips together and said, "Well," with a great deal contained in the single syllable, and pulled Maude into an embrace that was brief and fierce and said everything. Clara Louise Ralston did not, as it happened, show any signs of being trouble in the early months of her life. She was a quiet, watchful baby who regarded the world with an intense seriousness that Maude recognized immediately and privately considered her own chief legacy to her daughter. James, who was 2 years old, had initial strong opinions about the new arrival, opinions of the kind that any reasonable person would predict from a 2-year-old who had previously been the entire universe, and worked through these opinions with the assistance of his parents' patient consistency and the bribery of a small wooden horse that Billy carved for him. By the time Clara was 3 months old, James had designated himself her chief protector, and would sit beside her with the solemn purpose of a small boy who has been given an important job and intends to do it correctly. Maude and Seth exchanged glances above the heads of their children regularly, those glances that are the private language of two people who are both witnessing the same astonishing thing. The new school building opened in the spring of 1885, a proper two-room building with new desks and a stove that actually worked reliably and shelves for the growing collection of books. Eleanor, in Philadelphia, had by this point become something of a one-woman supply operation, sending parcels 2 or 3 times a year with books and educational materials, and occasionally small personal things for Maude, and once a small wooden toy for James that had wound itself up inside Eleanor's letters in ways that were hilarious to read. Eleanor had not visited, which was a distance and expense that was genuinely prohibitive, but the two women's correspondence had deepened into a friendship that was almost its own country, and Maude knew Eleanor's life in Philadelphia as thoroughly as if she had been present for it, through the medium of Eleanor's extraordinary letters. By the summer of 1885, Dusty Creek had grown, not dramatically but perceptibly, new families and new buildings and 2 new businesses, and the sense of a place in the process of becoming something more permanent. The school had 16 students now, and in the autumn of 1885 a second teacher arrived, a young man fresh from normal school in Illinois named Arthur Pope, who was 23 and somewhat terrified and extremely earnest, and Maude took him thoroughly under her wing and turned him, over the course of a year, into a genuinely good teacher, which was the most professionally satisfying thing she had done since coming to Dusty Creek. She was 30 years old in the autumn of 1885, standing in the larger schoolroom of the new building with chalk dust on her hands and both her rooms full of learning children, and she looked out the window toward the eastern horizon, where she could not see the ranch but knew exactly where it was, knew exactly what was happening there. Seth and Billy and Clem, and the cattle, and the land and James, who went with his father on Saturday mornings now, riding his own small horse with a concentration that made Seth look simultaneously worried and prouder than any man had a right to be. She had packed her bags to go back east. She had been standing on the street of this town with her life in a carpet bag and a ticket in her pocket, ready to concede that the West had gotten the better of her, ready to fold herself back into the shape the world had arranged for her birth. And a man she had noticed and not spoken to enough had come down the street with a crooked-stemmed wildflower and asked one question, and the question had been not simply whether she would stay, but whether she would look, really look, at what the life in front of her might contain. She had looked. She was still looking. On a particular Saturday afternoon that autumn, she rode out with Seth to the East Meadow, the two of them alone because James was with Billy and Clara was asleep in Mrs. Calloway's arms, because Margaret Calloway had been coming to the ranch on Saturdays for a year now, and no one had formally arranged this, but everyone found it entirely satisfactory. The aspens on the creek bank were gold, fully gold, the way they went in October, trembling gold, and the air was that particular autumn blue, and the grass was tawny, and the mountains were beginning to show snow on their high shoulders. They stopped their horses at the ridge above the meadow, the same place they had stopped on the first morning. She was wearing the turquoise ring as she always was. She looked at the meadow below, the creek catching the light, the aspens, the deer that were there again, always deer, as if the meadow maintained them for the purpose of being witnessed. "Do you ever think about what would have happened," she said, "if you had not come that morning?" He looked at the meadow for a moment. "Every day," he said quietly. "I think about it every day." "What does it look like when you think about it?" "Empty," he said simply. "All of it. Just empty." She reached across the distance between their horses and took his hand, the way he had taken hers 3 years ago on the porch in the evening light. He held it with the same quality he always had, careful and complete, the way a man held something he intended never to let go. The mountains sat on the horizon, blue and white, old and permanent and indifferent to the small affairs of human beings, which Maude had always found, strangely, comforting. The land did not need them to love it to be what it was. But she loved it anyway, fiercely and without apology, this vast and difficult and beautiful country that had not asked her to stay, that had not made it easy, that had given her the hardest and best years of her life. She had come west with chalk dust on her skirts and fire in her chest, and the belief that a person could build something meaningful in a place that needed what they had to offer. She had been right. She just hadn't known yet all the shapes that building could take. The aspens shivered gold in the meadow below, and the creek ran cold and clear over its stones, and the mountains stood where they had always stood, and Seth Ralston held her hand in the warm autumn light, and Maude Shelton, who had once been Maude Shelton with a packed bag and a ticket east, looked at the life spread before and behind her and found it, all of it, irreplaceably, exactly enough. In the winter of 1886, Clem got himself a girl, a fact announced by Billy with the pride of a man who considered Clem's romantic development his own personal project. Her name was Dorothy, and she was 18, the daughter of a farmer 2 valleys over, and she had a steady laugh and a practical nature that complemented Clem's enthusiasm well. Maude liked her immediately, with the particular warmth she felt for young women at the beginning of their own stories, and she told Clem privately that Dorothy was exactly right for him, which made Clem go the remarkable color he was capable of and say thank you very quietly and very sincerely. The ranch expanded in the spring of 1886, Seth acquiring the parcel of land to the south that his father had always thought was worth acquiring, and this meant more work and more cattle, and the hiring of another hand, a man of 40 named Samuel who had worked cattle from Texas to Montana, and had the calloused competence of someone who had done hard work for a long time and done it well. He was quiet and kept himself to himself and was excellent at his job, and Maude, who extended her natural interest in people to the men who worked on the ranch, found him over time to be a man of substance who had made some choices in his life that had cost him things he did not speak about, and who was here in the Wyoming territory building something new in the way that people came west to do. In early 1887, she received a letter from a leaner that was different from the usual ones. A leaner had been ill through the winter, a respiratory illness that had lasted longer than it should have, and the letter was thinner and more uncertain in its tone than a leaner's letters ever were. Maude read it at the kitchen table with the cold January morning outside and James at the table eating his breakfast with the single-minded focus of a 4-year-old who regarded food as a serious undertaking, and she felt the specific fear that came with the recognition that people you loved were not permanent. She wrote back immediately, a long letter, and then talked to Seth that evening. He listened and then said, "Do you want to go to Philadelphia?" with the directness she would never stop being grateful for. She thought about it. She thought about a leaner in a brick house on a tree-lined street, thin and uncertain in winter. She thought about the school and James and Clara and the ranch. "She has friends and doctors," Maude said slowly. "She is not alone, but I want her here." She looked at Seth. "I want to invite her to come here for the summer, if she is well enough to travel." "Write her that," Seth said. She wrote a leaner a letter that she considered one of the better letters of her life, which said that the Wyoming territory was magnificent in summer, and that there was a room with a good bed and her cousin who loved her, and that she should come. A leaner came in June of 1887, on the Union Pacific, and then the stage to Dusty Creek, arriving looking thinner than Maude remembered and more like herself than the winter letters had suggested, with 3 large trunks and a set of opinions about Western travel that she expressed with great energy from the moment she stepped off the stage. Maude held her on the street outside the stage office, and felt the particular wholeness of having someone you have only known through letters in the same physical space as yourself. A leaner was 40 years old, unmarried by choice rather than circumstance, and she was sharp and funny, and could read a situation with a speed that Maude always admired, and she looked at Seth Ralston, whom she was meeting for the first time, with the evaluating intensity of a woman who had been reading reports about this man for 5 years and now wanted to form her own conclusions. "He is everything you said," she told Maude privately, the second evening of her visit, sitting in the kitchen after the children were in bed and Seth had gone to check the horses, which both women understood was a diplomatic withdrawal. "Is he?" Maude said. "Bigger than I imagined," Alina said. "The hair is good. The hands are very good. He looks at you like you are solving a problem he has been working on for years," Maude laughed. "That is perhaps the most accurate description anyone has offered of how he looks at me." "I am very happy for you," Alina said, without any of her usual dry camouflage. "Genuinely and completely happy for you." Maude covered her hand. "Stay through the autumn," she said. Alina stayed through September, and in that time she got her color back and her energy back, and went completely native in terms of her admiration for the Wyoming landscape, which she had expected to find intimidating, and found instead transformative, writing letters east about the sky, and the mountains with a wonder that would have been unrecognizable in the Alina who had stepped off the stage. She spent her mornings reading and her afternoons in the school helping Maude with the upper students, bringing her Philadelphia education and her 40 years of reading to bear in a way the students found slightly alarming and greatly useful. She played with James and Clara with the ease of a woman who loved children without any sentimentality about them, as people rather than accessories, and James adored her with a completeness that was touching and slightly competitive. Clara observed her with the intense evaluating seriousness of a 2-year-old who was already, unmistakably, going to be a formidable person. When Alina left in late September, Maude stood on the street and watched the stage go with a grief that was clean, not the hollow loss of irretrievable things but the sharp temporary ache of distance, the kind that had its own end built into it. She had Alina's promise to return the following summer, a promise that Alina made with a directness that told Maude it was real. Seth stood beside her and did not say anything until she was ready to turn away from the stage, and then he said, "She was better when she left than when she arrived." And Maude said yes, that was true, and took his arm, and they walked back toward the wagon in the September afternoon light. By the autumn of 1887, James was 4 and Clara was 2, and the ranch and the school and the life were fully themselves, not in the process of becoming but actually arrived, a finished shape that was not static but growing in the way living things grow, adding rings of meaning each year. Dusty Creek had grown enough to support a proper doctor's office and a new hardware store, and a small hotel that was not the most elegant establishment she had ever seen but was solid and clean. And there was talk of a rail spur being extended toward the town, which would change it, everyone knew, though in what direction the changes would run was not yet clear. She and Seth talked about this sometimes, about what growth would mean, about the town they had come to know and in some ways depend on. She was not, she had discovered, someone who feared change for its own sake. What she cared about was the texture of a life, the specific quality of it, the meadow in the morning and the children in their school desks and Seth's hands on the reins beside her, and the mountains on the horizon doing their permanent, patient work of just being there. One afternoon in November of 1887, she was in the school after hours, finishing the marking she had not completed during the day, and she set down her pen and looked around at the room in the late afternoon light, at the rows of desks and the books on the shelves, and the maps on the wall and the chalkboard where she had written the day's lessons. She thought about the morning she had walked out of this town with a carpet bag, and the specific feeling of a place deciding it did not need you. She thought about the Wildflower. She thought about what a single question, asked at the right moment by the right person with the right combination of courage and hope, could open. She picked up her pen and finished her marking, and then she gathered her things and walked outside into the early winter evening, the air already cold and the stars coming out above the rooftops, the particular quality of a Wyoming evening in November, clean and cold and enormous. And she stood for a moment just breathing it, and then she walked toward where Seth was waiting with the wagon, because he always came to get her, every evening, in the same quiet way he had always done things. Without announcement and without failing, He was there, of course he was there. James was on the seat beside him, wrapped in a coat and hat, because he had apparently demanded to come, which was entirely in character. He saw Maude coming and stood up on the seat, which Seth immediately addressed with a hand on his collar that was gentle and prevented the falling off, and James waved with his free arm and shouted something that the evening wind took and turned into pure sound. Maude walked toward them in the cold November evening, toward her husband and her son, and the wagon that would take them home to the ranch where her daughter was with Mrs. Calloway by the fire, toward the life she had almost left and had instead found, toward all of it, every ordinary miraculous piece of it, and she thought that the territory could keep its cold and its scale and its difficult beauty and its enormous sky, that she would take all of it without complaint, that she had in fact been taking it and would go on taking it for as long as it was offered. She reached the wagon. Seth reached down a hand and she took it and he pulled her up to the seat, and James immediately climbed into her lap, which was not the intended arrangement but was the natural one, and Seth made a sound of mild protest and James ignored it with the completeness of a 4-year-old boy who had weighed the options. And Maude put her arms around her son and looked at her husband in the last of the evening light, and was happier than she had words for, and she had many words. She was a teacher. She had spent her life in words, and this was beyond them. He looked back at her with the look that Alina had described as a man solving a problem, and she understood now that what he was doing was not solving but recognizing, every time, the thing he had almost missed, the woman on the street with the carpet bag, and the way the morning had tilted on its axis when he stopped her. He picked up the reins. They drove home through the Wyoming evening, through the sage and the cold and the great dark quiet of the land, the stars coming out above them one by one in the enormous sky, the mountains a dark line against the deeper dark, the ranch appearing ahead of them with its warm windows and James asleep against Maude's shoulder long before they arrived, and the horses knowing the way without being told. They arrived. They were home.